Okay, so we're doing May, June 2019. Variant is 2, which is our variant, and paper is 2 as well. So let's start with the first question. I'm going to skip the response right now. I'm going to straight away go to our essay question. The 2A says, explain how economists use the concept of elasticity, okay, and to distinguish between inferior goods and necessary goods when consumers' income change. So keywords here are, what are the keywords here, guys? If you can, somebody can quickly tell me the keywords here for this. The keyword for me is, first of all, we need to talk about the concept of elasticity. And because it's inferior and necessary good, when income is changing, we need to talk about, like exactly YED, which is responsiveness of quantity demanded to change in income. So first we established the idea of elasticity measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in any variable. In this case, the change is consumers' income. So we look at YED, which is percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in income, right? Then we talk about this, that YED can be positive or negative. If it's positive YED, then when your income go up, your demand goes up. When your negative YED means when income go up, demand goes down. So when you have a positive YED, when income goes up, demand goes up, we have what we call a normal good, right? And when your income go up, demand goes down, we have what we call an inferior good, right? So we talk about this, that a normal good has a positive YED. When the income go up, demand go up, and a negative YED is for an inferior good, where income go up, demand go down, and we can give examples as well, right? So example, for example, is that, you can say private transport versus public transport would be inferior substitute to it, right? Then we talk about this in the context of necessary goods. Guys, if can somebody tell me about necessary goods? What are necessary goods, and what's the value of YED for necessary good? So what are necessary good? Anyone? Necessary good, very good. That's the word. We say necessary goods are income inelastic. They are income inelastic goods, which basically means that as your income go up or down, the change in income will not lead to. So yeah, we can say this percentage change in income will be greater than percentage change in quantity. So which means that not that responsive to a change in quantity. Example, somebody give a very good example, rice or bread are what we call income inelastic, because despite any change in income, you won't see the demand to change that much. So you can talk about here the YED, both the value as well as the sign is of significance. The lower the value of YED, the more the good is a necessity. The higher the value, the more it is not a necessity or a luxury good. Secondly, the sign of the YED tells us whether it's a normal or inferior good. And inferior good, of course, can also be income inelastic or income elastic. So does that make sense, guys? So necessary good would have a very low income elasticity of demand. And talk about why is it very low. It could be positive or negative. Typically positive, when your income go up, you might demand more, but because it's a necessity, you're always already buying the right quantity to begin with. Make sense, guys? Any questions about the first part? Okay. The next part says discussed by the businesses, how business might attempt to change the price elastic demand for their product and consider which approach is most likely to be successful. This is a very popular exam question. I want everyone to prepare this. Like every sort of exam that we're doing, we see one of these kind of questions that are coming, which is either about relevance of YD, PED, XED, and one of these questions is also about about how useful is PED and how can we change it. So what is PED exactly, Shaukat? I'll start with the definition of PED, which is basically percentage. It's the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in income, right? Then we talk about the second thing we talk about is the formula. Formula is percentage change in quantity demanded or percentage change in income. So the formula, let me write that formula also. It's percentage change in QD over percentage change in price, right? Percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. Then we talk about this, that PED, because we're saying how by business might be attempting to change the PED for the product and consider which approach is most likely to be successful. So guys, if I can ask you, what are the ways that you can change the PED? Anyone? You can make it more elastic or versus inelastic by changing the factors, right? So if I list down, guys, list down the factors, it will be very easy for us to figure out which ones are. So no, guys, just first let's list down the factors, because I think what you guys are doing is not the right way to go about it. Tell me all the factors that affect PED of a good. Number one is number and closeness of substitutes, right? I'm going to list down all of these factors because I think the better approach is that you need to first list down so that you know you have a framework around which you can give an answer. Because what you guys are telling me, advertisement, marketing campaign, and all that factors, they're not tackling the question with a framework. Okay, so number and closeness of substitutes, that's the first one, right? Number two is proportion of income spent. Number three is nature of good. Very good, nature of the good. Number four is time period under consideration. Nature of the good, by the way, means is it a necessity or a luxury? And number five is it habit forming or not? Now, let's look at after discussing, I mean, after putting down the factors, let's look at the way we can go about it. So, guys, businesses can change the elasticity of demand, make it more inelastic by, first of all, changing the attributes of the product. If you change the attributes of the product, and if you can make it more distinct, right, through either through marketing, right, or through basically what we call product features, right, you can make it more inelastic, right? Number one is that. So either you make it distinct, which means reduce the number of substitutes, and that can make it more inelastic by basically putting out some different features of it or marketing the different features of it so that people start to assume that their product is different from the competitors out there. Then it's proportion of income spent, which means that expensive goods will tend to be more elastic than inexpensive goods. So maybe, yes, you can say this, that maybe by lowering price, we can make the proportion of income to go down and make that more inelastic. like a matchbox is inelastic, and so on. Got it? Then comes the nature of the good. If it's a necessity, like a vaccine, right, then it is basically going to be inelastic in demand. So what we can say here in this context, guys, is this, that, if the good is something which is required. I mean, for example, right, a good example of this is that if the conditions change for a product, it can become more inelastic in demand, right? For example, like in the time of COVID, masks became inelastic in demand. So maybe if a good is a necessity, then it will be inelastic in demand. Having said that, how can we change basically its features to make it more inelastic? Seems to be a difficult one, because if it's a necessity, then the reason why it's a necessity is because it's important for survival. Making a good a necessity may not be easy to do for the firm. And clearly, habit forming good is also something which is linked with the marketing or product features. You can make the good habit forming or make it like a behavior of people. And a good example of this is Coke and Pepsi were able to, in the 90s, make it a drink which everyone would consume when they're having their lunch or dinner. So that became like a habit forming feature of the product, which made the good more inelastic. And you can say this can be done through, again, marketing, brand awareness, so that you can reduce the number of substitutes, as well as make it as a good, make it as a sort of a good which becomes habit forming period. Similarly, time period is something which makes a good more elastic with more substitutes coming into play. Now, guys, next part of this is how business might attempt to make the demand more elastic or inelastic. We can talk about that. Once we've talked about that, we now need to talk about basically the evaluation, because they're saying discuss how businesses might attempt to change the price elastic demand for their product, and consider which approach is most likely to be successful. And I think the most likely successful one would be what? If you can look at this discussion, guys, which is the most successful thing that you could do? Time period, Madhya, is not under your control, right? Time period is, in the long run, you will have substitutes, and your demand will become more sort of elastic. Make sense? Okay, guys, which one is more important? Which feature is more important? Anyone? Guys, give me 1 minute. I think the marketing and product features are something which is in your control. And I think that could be something which you could manipulate. However, having said that, it is something which is probably the only way you could make your good distinct. And so maybe effective marketing could be the best way to go forward when it comes to product features, right? That basically also can make your good habit forming if people associate with it, and so on, right? So we can argue this, that probably marketing product features is the way to go forward. Price is another feature also, making it cheaper. Having said that, it's something which may not be desirable, given that there is a particular cost that you might incur. So you might also not want to tackle with this. Price discrimination is not a good argument because price discrimination is a very complicated argument. Something which we haven't done when we do in the A2, we'll discuss price discrimination in detail. So you'll realize it's not a valid argument to be given here. Okay. Any questions about this? Guys, so the way I went about it is that I wrote the features and I discussed each features, and then in the light of those features, I made an argument about what is in your control versus what is not in your control. And I have a lot to write therefore. Who is say can we elaborate on this, but in the end argue that over time PED naturally changes anyway when trend and factor changes? Well, not necessarily, you know, like it's true that more substitutes will always come, but you need to keep on innovating to make sure that you became relevant and more inelastic than your competitors. Makes sense? So, I mean, you can't, I mean, while I agree with your argument, you need to also say that it is in your control. Madhya, I just gave you evaluation, right? So what is our evaluation, guys? Anyone? Our evaluation is basically the idea that of all these features, marketing and product features seems to be more realistic or seems to be more in control of the firm. If you are successful in terms of creating brand awareness, having a strong marketing plan, or making your products more distinct by providing innovation and product features, you can reduce the number and closeness of substitutes, and you can also make the good habit forming, which basically means that when your revenue can go up, when your price go up. Are you saying market? Yeah, market control is in our control. Yeah, I mean, it seems to be the feature that you can make it. Your argument is fine. That, you know, like in the long run, trends and factors change and demand can become more elastic, which actually warrants firms to probably spend more money on product features so that they stay relevant in the market. Maybe you can say that. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the next question. Distinguish between regressive and progressive taxes and explain whether you would use an income tax or a specific indirect tax to make post-tax incomes equal. It's a good question. So let's start with talking about progressive and regressive taxes. So guys, regressive or progressive taxes are basically when your income go up and your tax rate also goes up, we call it a progressive tax. Right? But when your income go up and your tax rate goes down, we call it regressive tax. Okay, so a good example of a regressive tax would be what we call a specific indirect tax, which is a tax like a flat amount of $5. So irrespective of the rich or the poor, whoever buys the good will pay a $5 tax. So this is irrespective of the income. Both the rich and the poor pay the same amount of the tax, right? And similarly, an income tax, which is basically, it's a regressive tax. An income tax can be made progressive if, for example, income tax is on income. So when the income go up and your tax rate also goes up, we can make the income tax to be progressive. Okay. Now, the question is also asking, if you want to make the post-tax incomes more equal, what kind of a tax do you want? Yes, I wrote that, that your specific indirect tax is regressive in nature, while progressive tax is income tax. Munir? Can we talk about this right now? Yeah, this. I thought I wrote. Okay, guys. Secondly, sorry, quickly. So my question is, what do you need to know? If you want to make post-tax more equal, what do you need to do? And the answer is that progressive tax are deemed as more fair because what we can do is that if there is a person who's rich, you can, with income which is high, you can the tax rate could be increased so that income after tax goes down, or disposable income goes down, making incomes more equal. So income taxes, which are progressive taxes, can make more equal distribution of income. Okay, while specific indirect taxes are regressive, which means irrespective of the income. So they are unfair because the rich and the poor are paying two different amounts of taxes. Got it? Are we good? Makes sense? Any questions, guys? Are we good to move on? Awesome. Now, I want to now talk about the next question, which is discuss whether subsidies on the production of all types of goods will lead to an improved allocation of resources. This is a good question about subsidies. So let's first talk about subsidies. What are subsidies? Right? What are they? How they impact demand and supply, right? Number three is, like when demand supply means your equilibrium. Then we'll talk about, because the question is asking us, discuss whether subsidies on production of all type, the keyword here is all type of goods will lead to an improve. So then impact on demand supply and will lead to an improve. This thing will lead to an improved allocation of reserve. And where are they effective or ineffective? Okay, so this is what we're going to answer in our basically question. So guys, let's start with the first thing. So what are subsidies? Subsidies are basically payments given by the government to encourage the production of a good. It lowers the cost of production. So if this is my demand and supply, right, and my price is P naught, quantity is Q naught, a subsidy will lead to supply curve to shift to the right. It results in the price of the good to go down and the quantity demanded to go up. Right, so that's the first thing first. So we define subsidies. So subsidies are basically, now the next part is that whether subsidies on production of all types of will lead to an improvement. So how do they, so we've answered what is a subsidy, right? A subsidy is a per unit grant given by the government to increase the production of a good. Now, what kind of a goods should we give a subsidy to? And the answer is that we can give a subsidy basically whenever the allocation of resources is not effective, for example, in terms of merit goods, or goods with positive externalities. Subsidies could be very useful. How? Because in the case of merit goods or good with positive externality, there is what we call underconsumption of the goods. okay, under consumption or under provision. And in such a case, we can give subsidies to improve the allocation. And I can draw the diagram here. And I did draw the diagram earlier also. For example, in the case of your sort of education, which is what we call a merit good, the demand isn't enough. Or let's talk about vaccines. The demand should be more. That's the demand should be here, right? Now, if the government doesn't give any subsidy, the demand may not be this demand. Demand will stay at D naught because this is a demand that should be consumed. This is a demand that is actual. So D naught is the actual demand, right? And D1 is what we call the socially desirable demand, right? So what can the government do to make the socially desirable quantity of Q1 to be consumed? Well, they can give a subsidy. If they give a subsidy equal to this much, if they give a subsidy equal to AB, right, you will see the provision of this good to become socially desirable. Automatically, the price will go down to P1, quantity will go up, and we will be able to achieve what we call the right quantity. Now, you can't give subsidies to some goods. What are the goods you can't give subsidies to? Or what are the examples of where subsidy can not work? Right? Number one, you can't give it to, for example, demerit goods, right? Or goods that are harmful to people, right? Number two, subsidies may not be desirable in the case of even like public goods, because public goods are, what we say, non-rival and non-excludable, right? And because of that, public goods may, although have a provision issue, but because there is a free rider problem, there is no demand for these goods, and therefore when you give a subsidy, it still will not solve the problem, because the government has to provision the good completely. So government has to provision the good completely because the market has no provision. So number one, you can't give it to demerit goods, right? Number two, you can't even give it to goods which are public goods, because the question is saying, and you can give it to private goods which are merit or are even necessities. In the case of necessity, you can give a subsidy also to make goods affordable on the grounds of, like making poor people benefit from it. So you can give it on merit goods and necessity, but not to sort of public goods or demerit goods and so on, right? Somebody actually gave some argument, who is actually said some of the things that maybe we can conclude by looking at some of the problems of subsidies, that subsidies have its own set of challenges. Number one, it puts a burden on taxpayers, right? Also, it has a challenge that it may, the government may over or under subsidize if they have a lack of knowledge. Number three is this, that it doesn't allow the market to operate freely. The market to operate freely. And yeah, good job, Shaukat. There is a over reliance, something, there's a reliance on subsidies. Sometimes we start relying on subsidies. Yeah, so these are some of the answers that, I mean, some of the things that I can write about. Also, like we also talk about elasticity, because if the good is inelastic and we give a subsidy to the good, the price will fall by much more and consumers will benefit much more from subsidies. So yeah, elasticity matters if you want to benefit. So if the good is inelastic, then subsidy benefits consumers in terms of lower prices. So Hani is saying, is it also that a subsidy is temporary or is it permanent? I mean, it depends on government. So government will make it a permanent subsidy. You never know. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to move to number 4. Explain using examples what is meant by protectionism and show with the help of a diagram how export subsidies can be considered as a form of protectionism. So guys, export subsidy is a good discussion to have, but what is meant by protectionism? Protectionism is basically provision. Sorry, Munir is asking, what do we mean by provision? Means to provide. So under provision means under provided. Either consumers are not asking for it or producers are not asking for it. So guys, sorry, coming back to subsidy person, does it improve the provision of all the goods or does it improve the production? Does it improve allocation of resources for all the goods? And the answer is no, it does not, right? So this is our conclusion. Okay, explain using examples what is meant by protectionism. Protectionism is when the government decides to put trade barriers, right? Trade barriers, and in terms of tariffs or quotas or other non-price barriers, like we saw in our notes, there were other non-price barriers, like for example, the government is basically, put like paperwork and other requirements. And the idea is this, that these trade barriers will basically make it more difficult for foreign producers to sell, and it will basically help in domestic producers to produce more as the level of imports to fall or level of exports to rise. Okay, because export subsidies, how does they work or how do they work? Let's talk about that. So guys, how can you become an exporter? Right? Let's say if this is demand and supply, right? And this is your price and quantity. Now, if the world price is here, okay, remember, if the world price is PW, what happens if the world price is PW, guys? Then your domestic supply will be Q1, your domestic demand will be Q2, and this becomes my level of exports. Isn't that true? Yeah. So if now this is the diagram that basically makes you an exporter. But now look at this diagram, guys. Can we relate this as an existing form of dumping? It is dumping. The subsidy is a dumping. You're right. So guys, let's say your price was P naught. Sorry, something weird came. price is P naught, quantity is Q naught, right? And the world price is here, PW, right? Now, when you give a subsidy, supply curve will shift to the right. And if I give a subsidy such that supply curve shifts to the right all the way to like here, right? So supply curve from S0 goes to S1, supply curve shifts to the right. So this becomes my price PW. And now if you look at this, Q2 is your domestic supply, Q1 is your domestic demand, and you are looking at this kind of a export to happen. So you give your domestic producers so much subsidy that they not only are able to meet domestic demand, but they're able to also export. Are you all with me? Does that make sense? Right? So kind of like you make this kind of a diagram, but assume that your supply was previously above and then became S1. So you gave a subsidy to make your exports to go up. Got it, guys? Are we good? Okay, so talk about how the world price will be higher than the domestic price, making you an exporter. It is a kind of protectionism because you are making it. Can I explain this diagram or this diagram? On the right or the left, Amal? Left. In the left, I just showed you if this was your demand supply before, right? And price was P naught, you were an importer of the good because the world price was lower, but the government gave you so much subsidy that your supply curve went to the right beyond Q1. And so not only you were able to provide all the demand for the domestic market, but also were able to export. Q2 minus Q1 becomes your export. Make sense? So that's the answer for this one. Okay, guys. Discuss the arguments that are used to justify protectionism and consider whether these arguments can ever be justified. So what are the arguments? This is a fairly straightforward question. I don't need to sort of spend too much time, but the arguments are infant industry argument. The argument is job protection. The argument is dumping. The argument is balance of payment. So the four arguments that are out there. Infant industry, which is new industries, which has a potential comparative advantage. Number two is sunset industry or job protection, where you're trying to sort of protect jobs. The third one is dumping, which is kind of illegal and a good reason for you to protect your trade. And the last one is basically your balance of payment. Now, what are the counter arguments to it? And if you look at the notes, we've given like counter arguments as we moved along. So for example, when it comes to infant industry argument, you are looking at potential comparative advantage. However, if you are ending up with industries that do not have a potential comparative advantage, then you are basically making the consumers, domestic consumers, to suffer. Number one. Number two, for the sunset industry argument or job protection, there could be a possible argument against it in terms of retaliation. Retaliation is basically when you are foreign firms are ending up with foreign firms end up putting trade barriers to your goods where you are doing well, and therefore you may lose jobs in that sector. For dumping, there is no counter argument, which is it's a good reason for you to protect your trade because somebody's trying to sell below the cost of production because either he's overproduced or he's trying to do predatory pricing. And last one is for the balance payment, again, it may not be useful because countries can retaliate and it may not be a good way to go about it. Yeah, so I mean, it's right to point out that like complacency may set in for infant industry argument, and you might not see firms to ever become independent. You don't need to mention tariffs and quota in this argument, in this question. So whether these arguments can ever be justified, and the answer is yes, they can be justified on the grounds of dumping. You can say on grounds of dumping they can be justified. For all other reasons, maybe it may not be a good reason to put trade protection. Having said that, creating competitive advantage will be a good reason. They can cause trade cost push for inflation, but I may not want to mention it here. I've got so much to write. You've got so much to write here, so guys, you don't need to mention this. This is a very good paper. All of the 3 questions are pretty nice and doable, and they were from micro and macro. So yeah, that's a good paper. Now, this data response, we can do it next time. Yeah, let's do it tomorrow. Now, tomorrow, what time is our class? Tomorrow is Wednesday. Our class tomorrow, I'm going to send you an email as well, will be from 11 to 12. Okay, because I have something going on at 4 to 5. So 11 to 12 will be our